On the resolute desk in the Oval Office, for 3 years, sat a coconut. Not a photograph of one, the actual husk, shellacked, mounted on mahogany, carried from a beach in the Solomons to a paperweight under the hand of the President of the United States. Carved into its skin were 15 words that should not have existed. The man who carved them should have burned to death on August 2nd, 1943, in water 8 degrees south of the equator. A Japanese destroyer captain, moving at 40 knots through absolute darkness, made certain of it. He watched the plywood split. He watched the fuel ignite. He steamed north, believing he had just killed every American aboard. He was wrong about one of them. The water that night was the color of wet coal. Blackett Strait sits between Kolombangara and Arundel in the Central Solomons, a funnel of reef and current roughly 4 miles wide at its narrowest. And on August 1st, 1943, it was the most contested stretch of ocean on Earth. The Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night here. For 11 months, elite destroyer crews trained at Etajima had run the corridor after sundown, delivering rice and ammunition and men to the starving garrison on Kolombangara, then racing north before American aircraft could find them at dawn. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it duty. 15 PT boats idled in the strait that night to stop them. Plywood, 80 feet long, 56 tons, crewed by men who, 18 months earlier, had been law students and insurance clerks and Harvard seniors. The oldest boat captain in the formation was 28. Their torpedoes were Mark 8s, a design drawn up before the First World War. Half of them would not run straight. The other half would not detonate. Against them came 4 Fubuki-class destroyers, Amagiri, Hagikaze, Arashi, Shigure, moving in line ahead at 30 knots, each carrying 2,050 tons of steel and a veteran crew that had survived Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and Vila. The senior officer aboard Amagiri, Captain Katsumori Yamashiro of the 11th Destroyer Flotilla, had been at sea under the Rising Sun flag since 1921. The ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami, had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy when the American boy, now commanding PT-109, was still in boarding school in Connecticut. The mathematics of the encounter, on paper, favored the Japanese absolutely. The Fubuki class carried 6 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets and 8 24-inch Type 93 torpedoes, the Long Lance, each warhead 4 times heavier than anything the Americans could fire back. A single Type 93 could break a heavy cruiser in half. The PT boats had 4 torpedoes that might or might not work, and a handful of .50 caliber machine guns that could not scratch a destroyer's armor belt. The Japanese knew all of this. They had studied the Elco boats in their own intelligence manuals, with accurate deck plans and accurate specifications since before Pearl Harbor. They knew the plywood. They knew the reservists. They knew the horsepower and the fuel capacity and the torpedo count. And they had drawn from all of that precise, accurate information exactly the wrong conclusion: that boats like these, crewed by men like these, could not stop an empire. Lieutenant Commander Hanami's 15-year career had been built for decisive fleet engagements against battleships. Instead, on the night of August 1st, 1943, he was delivering groceries. And he was about it. The document that decided everything in Blackett Strait that night was not a flight plan or a convoy order. It was a 1936 study prepared at the Imperial Japanese Naval Staff College, titled in translation, Estimates of American National Character and Wartime Resolve. And a copy of it sat on the desk of every operations officer in the combined fleet. 53 pages. The first 19 were devoted to a single thesis: that the United States, as a society, was incapable of absorbing the casualties required to fight a prolonged war in the Western Pacific. The authors used the phrase Yowamushi no Kokumin, a nation of weaklings. This was not the conclusion of one cranky admiral. It was consensus. It was taught. It was the foundation on which every Japanese war plan from 1937 onward had been built. The men who wrote it were not stupid. They were the most educated naval officers in Asia, fluent in English, subscribers to Jane's fighting ships, graduates of exchange programs at Annapolis and Princeton. They had read Mahan. They had read Mitchell. They had visited the Ford plant at River Rouge and taken notes. What they lacked was not data. What they lacked was the cultural flexibility to believe what the data meant. And so the Imperial Japanese Navy built itself around a single idea: the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. One great fleet engagement, executed with superior training and superior courage, would shatter American will. Everything else was preliminary. Submarines existed to thin the enemy line before the battle. Destroyers existed to deliver torpedoes during the battle. Aircraft carriers existed to blind the enemy before the battle. The battle itself was the only thing that mattered, and the battle would be won by the elite. Elite was the operative word. The training pipeline at Etajima produced roughly 300 naval officers in a class. The selection rate was less than 3% of applicants. Candidates spent 3 to 4 years in a regime that combined celestial navigation, kendo, English literature, and systematic beatings administered by senior classmen. The product was extraordinary. Men who could read a star fix in a typhoon, identify a ship class at 6 miles in moonlight, and fire a torpedo solution in their heads while a cruiser disintegrated around them. Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami was one of these men. So was every officer on the bridge of every destroyer running the Tokyo Express. The assumption embedded in this system was that quality would always be quantity. Because quantity, the kind of quantity the United States could theoretically produce, could never be properly trained. A 90-day officer was a joke. A civilian shipyard run by women was a joke. An 80-foot plywood boat commanded by a congressman's son was the punchline of the joke. The contempt was not loud. It was pitying. Japanese officers who interrogated American prisoners in 1942 and 1943 often wrote home describing the captives as kawaiso, pitiable, not hated, not feared, pitied. The way a tradesman might pity a tourist who wandered into his workshop and picked up a tool he did not understand. In the margin of one captured operations order from the 8th Fleet, an unnamed staff officer wrote, in Japanese, "The Americans send their children." They did send their children. That part was accurate. What the 1936 study failed to predict was how many and how fast. Between February 1942 and March 1945, the United States Navy ran 1,797 officers and 11,668 enlisted men through a 3-month curriculum at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's Training Center at Melville, Rhode Island. 3 months. A PT boat officer at Melville received, in 12 weeks, roughly 40% of the tactical instruction a Japanese officer received in 4 years. And then he was put on a boat and shipped to the Solomons. By the time the facility closed, roughly 2,500 officers and 20,000 sailors had passed through the gates. That number is worth sitting with. Every graduating class from Etajima produced 300 men. Every 3 months, Melville produced more. The ratio that mattered was not tons of shipping. It was not gallons of fuel. It was men. For every one elite Japanese destroyer officer trained in the 4 years before the war, the United States was producing in a single facility, in a single specialty, during a single year of the war, roughly 8 fully qualified junior officers ready to take a boat into combat. And Melville was one of dozens of training centers. The 1936 study had accounted for American industry. It had accounted for American oil. It had accounted, in a page and a half, for American aircraft production. It had not accounted for the possibility that a capitalist democracy could take its college sophomores, run them through an assembly line, and produce ocean warriors faster than the Imperial Japanese Navy could kill them. On the bridge of Amagiri, at 4 minutes past 2 in the morning on August 2, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Hanami was about to meet one of those sophomores. The sea around PT-109 was glass. No moon, no wind. The boat was running on one engine to hide its wake, 3 of the 12 cylinders of the center Packard ticking over at idle. The outboard engines, cold. On the bridge, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy had been awake for 19 hours. He was 26 years old. His back hurt. He had not fired a torpedo all night because he had not seen anything to fire at. The radar on PT-159, the squadron flagship, had picked up contacts earlier, and the lead boats had launched their fish in the dark and missed everything. And then the lead boats had gone home because their torpedoes were gone. Standard doctrine. Nobody had told PT-109. So PT-109 was still out there, idling, waiting. Ensign George Ross stood on the bow. He had come aboard that afternoon as a replacement for a sick man, and he had never been on a PT boat in combat before. He was holding a 37mm anti-tank gun that the crew had lashed to the forward deck 2 days earlier with rope because the armorer at Lumbari thought it might be useful. Ross was staring into the black. He saw it first. Not a ship, a shape. A shape that was not water. A darker dark moving across the darker dark, and then a white curl at the base of it that his eye took half a second to recognize as a bow wave, and another half second to recognize as a bow wave moving at 30 knots directly at him. He shouted! Kennedy turned. The helm spun. The center engine roared and the clutches engaged, and the boat began, very slowly, to turn. On the bridge of Amagiri, 600 yards ahead and closing, Lieutenant Commander Hanami saw the American boat at almost the same instant. What happened in the next 10 seconds has been argued about by historians for 80 years, because the 2 senior officers on that bridge told 2 different stories. Captain Yamashiro, the flotilla commander, wrote after the war that he shouted for a turn to port, to evade, because he was terrified that ramming would detonate the American torpedoes and blow Amagiri's bow off. Hanami, the ship's captain, wrote to then Congressman Kennedy in 1952 that he had ordered a turn to starboard on purpose, to ram, because the American was too close to evade and a glancing blow along his own hull would have gutted the destroyer. Both orders may have been given. Neither mattered. At 40 knots, a 2,050-ton destroyer does not turn in 600 yards. The bow of Amagiri struck PT-109 just forward of the starboard torpedo tube at an angle of approximately 20 degrees. The sound, according to survivors in the water seconds later, was not an explosion. It was a sustained tearing. The sound of a wooden boat being opened along its grain by a steel wedge the size of a building. The forward section of PT-109, with Kennedy on the bridge and 3 men in the cockpit, was shoved sideways and down. The aft section, with the engines and 2 men below, was ripped free and flipped onto its side. The 100-octane aviation gasoline in the port wing tank went up in a column of blue-white flame that briefly made the strait look like noon. In the engine room, motor machinist's mate First Class Patrick McMahon was standing next to the center Packard when the compartment came apart around him. The fuel ignited. His uniform ignited. The hair on his arms ignited. He crawled toward what he thought was a hatch and went through a hole that had not existed 4 seconds earlier, into water that was 40 degrees cooler than the fire, and passed out. On the bridge of Amagiri, Lieutenant Commander Hanami felt the impact as a single hard thump through his feet. He looked aft. He saw a wall of flame where an American boat had been, and the wake of his own destroyer carrying the fire north. And then the flame was behind him, and the strait was black again. He gave no order to stop. The standing order for Tokyo Express runs was absolute. Never slow down in the strait. He was back in Rabaul by breakfast. In the water, Kennedy found McMahon face down and burning. He grabbed the strap of McMahon's life jacket and turned him over. McMahon's face was destroyed. Kennedy could hear him breathing through what was left of it. 2 other men, Harris and Starkey, were calling from 30 yards away. Harris was wounded in the leg. Starkey was uninjured, but could not swim well enough to reach the wreckage alone. Kennedy towed McMahon back to the floating hulk of the bow section, which was still burning at one end and still afloat at the other, and then he went back into the water for Harris, then for Starkey, then for Zinser, then for Johnston, who had swallowed gasoline and was vomiting. In the first 45 minutes after the collision, Kennedy, whose Navy medical file contained the phrase, chronic lower back strain, unfit for sea duty, went into the burning water 6 times. 11 men were alive on the hulk at dawn. 2, Harold Marney and Andrew Kirksey, were not. They were never found. The hulk stayed afloat until about noon on August 2nd, and then it rolled. The crew had been arguing for hours about what to do. Kennedy had asked every man in turn. Some wanted to surrender to the Japanese on Kolombangara, 3.5 miles east. Some wanted to fight it out with the sidearms they had salvaged. Kennedy said no to both, and when the hull rolled, he pointed at a cluster of specks on the southwest horizon. Plum Pudding Island, 4 miles away, outside the main Japanese patrol lanes, and said they were swimming. He put a board under McMahon's back. He took the strap of McMahon's life jacket in his teeth, breaststroking on his back, and towed him. 4 hours in the water. McMahon's skin came off in sheets on Kennedy's hands. The salt entered the burns, and McMahon asked twice to be left to drown, and both times Kennedy bit down harder on the strap and kept kicking. Behind them, the other 9 men moved in a rough line, the weaker swimmers clinging to a 2x6 plank Ensign Tom had pulled from the wreckage. They reached Plum Pudding at sundown. Kennedy crawled onto the sand, vomited salt water for 10 minutes, and then stood up. He told the crew to hide in the brush. Then he walked back into the water, the same water, with a lantern and a pistol, because the shipping lane ran past the island on the far side, and there might be American boats looking for survivors. There were not. He swam for 2 hours in the dark and came back empty-handed at 3 in the morning, so sick with exhaustion and swallowed seawater that his men had to drag him into the bushes. The next day, he did it again, to a different island, Nauru, 1.5 miles south, where a coconut grove might mean fresh water. There was no fresh water. There were 2 abandoned canoes, a small cache of Japanese crackers and candy left by a passing patrol, and, on the beach, 2 men staring at him. Byuku Gasa and Aroni Kumana were Solomon Islanders, scouts working for an Australian coast watcher named Arthur Reginald Evans, who was hidden in a camouflaged observation post 600 feet up the slope of Kolombangara. Evans had seen the fireball on the night of the collision. He had radioed Guadalcanal. He had been told the American boat was presumed lost with all hands. But Evans, on his own initiative, had sent his scouts paddling through Japanese patrolled waters to check anyway, because that was what the Coast Watcher Network did. It checked anyway. Gasa and Kumana did not speak English. Kennedy did not speak Pidgin. For a long moment, on a beach on the wrong side of the war, nobody said anything. Then Kennedy reached for a green coconut on the ground, took the sheath knife from his belt, and carved into the husk, WWII, Commander. Native knows, posset he can pilot. 11. Alive, needs small boat. Kennedy. He handed the coconut to Byuku Gasa. He mimed paddling. He pointed south, toward where he guessed the nearest American base must be. Gasa looked at the coconut, looked at the white man with the cracked lips and the ruined uniform, and nodded once. Gasa and Kumana paddled 38 miles in an open dugout canoe through waters patrolled by Japanese barges and aircraft. They delivered the coconut to a New Zealand infantry officer at Wana Wana. The coconut went from Wana Wana to Rendova by PT boat. On the night of August 7, 1943, 6 days after the ramming, PT-157 slipped into the reef off Olasana Island, where Kennedy had moved the crew. A recognition signal was exchanged, 4 shots into the air, then 4 back. Kennedy stepped out of the brush and said to Lieutenant William Liebenow on the bow of PT-157, "Where the hell have you been?" Liebenow answered, "We've got some food for you." Kennedy said, "No thanks, I just had a coconut." Every living man came home. Patrick McMahon, whose burns had been judged fatal by 2 different medics in the first 12 hours, survived. He lived until 1990. He attended the inauguration in 1961, sitting in the reviewing stand, and when the new President of the United States walked past, he stood up, and Kennedy stopped the line and came over to shake his hand. 11 men, 6 days, 1 coconut. In the margin of a Japanese intelligence summary filed in Rabaul on August 4, 1943, 2 days after Amagiri reported ramming and destroying an American PT boat in Blackett Strait, an unnamed staff officer added a single line of handwritten notation beside the entry. Enemy crew presumed annihilated. The document is held today in the National Archives, captured at the end of the war. The notation was never corrected. The moment that mattered most in the 6 days between the ramming and the rescue did not happen on Plum Pudding, or on Nauru, or on the beach where the coconut was carved. It happened on the second night, August 3rd, at Ferguson Passage. Ferguson Passage is a gap in the reef 4 miles southwest of Plum Pudding, the channel that American PT boats use to enter and leave Blackett Strait. Kennedy had calculated, correctly, that if any American boat were going to come through the area, it would come through there. On the evening of August 3rd, wearing nothing but underwear and a rubber life belt, carrying a .38 revolver with 6 rounds, and the ship's lantern wrapped in a kapok jacket, he swam out alone into the open ocean. The water was warm on the surface and cold 10 feet down. The current in the passage ran at 2 knots. Kennedy swam for 3 hours to reach the center of the channel, treading water with the lantern held above his head, waiting to flash it at the sound of engines. No engines came. The PT squadron, believing PT-109 lost, had rerouted its patrols. The passage was empty. At some point after midnight, the current began to carry him, and he could not fight it, and he let it take him. He drifted. He was, by his own later description, more asleep than awake. At one point, he believed he had died and was watching himself from above. At another, he believed he was back at Harvard and late for a class. The current carried him in a slow arc, east, then north, then west, and deposited him, after roughly 8 hours in the water, on a small sandbar called Leorava, half a mile from where he had started. He crawled onto the sand. He vomited. He slept. He woke up and realized, with the terrible clarity of a man who has come back from somewhere he was not supposed to return from, that the lantern was gone, and the pistol was gone, and he had failed. He swam back to Plum Pudding, 2 more miles. He arrived in the afternoon of August 4th, unable to speak, and collapsed into the arms of Ensign Tom, who had given him up for dead 6 hours earlier. And then, this is the part that does not fit inside any doctrine written at Iwo. The next evening, August 4th, Kennedy ordered Ensign Ross to try it again. Ross went. He failed also. He came back. Then Kennedy tried a third time. This is what the 1936 study at the Imperial Japanese Naval Staff College could not account for. Not the industrial output, not the training pipeline, not the women in the Elko plant at Bayonne running 3 shifts. The thing it could not account for was that a 26-year-old lieutenant junior grade with a damaged spine and salt-cracked lips and 10 men depending on him would decide, not once, but 3 times, that swimming into the open Pacific at night with a flashlight was a reasonable plan, because the alternative was letting his crew die. The Kantai-Kessen doctrine was built around decisive battles fought by elite professionals who would never be replaced. What it encountered in Blackett Strait was a different physics entirely. A man who was not elite, not a professional, not particularly well trained, and entirely replaceable on the squadron roster, who nonetheless refused to be replaced in his own mind, refused to stop, refused to let McMahon drown, refused to surrender, refused to die on schedule. When Lieutenant Commander Hanami, 12 years later, sat down in a small house in Japan to write a letter to the now Senator Kennedy, he did not write about the ramming. He wrote about what he had learned afterward. He wrote, "I had heard that the American commander had saved all of his men. I could not understand this for a long time. In our Navy, we were taught that when the ship is lost, the men are lost. I wondered what kind of man had been on that small boat." Amagiri did not survive the war. On April 23, 1944, 8 months after slicing PT-109 in half, she struck a mine off the coast of Borneo and went down with most of her crew. Captain Yamashiro was not aboard. He had been reassigned. Lieutenant Commander Hanami had been reassigned also to a desk job in Tokyo. And so both men who had argued on the bridge that night in Blackett Strait lived to see the surrender. Lieutenant General Arasue Seizo, Chief of Army Intelligence, sat down with American interrogators in October 1945 and admitted, in a sentence that still reads like a confession in a confessional, that the highest levels of Japanese command had miscalculated American capacity fundamentally and from the beginning. Commander Masatake Okumiya, in his own interrogation, was asked why Rabaul and Truk, the 2 great fortresses of the Japanese outer perimeter, had been neutralized without a single ground assault. He answered in one phrase: inability to supply. The islands had not been defeated. They had been left to starve, the way Kolombangara had been left to starve after the PT boats and their modified 40mm guns tore the barge traffic to ribbons in the coastal shallows. The coconut went home with Kennedy. He kept it in his desk drawer at the Senate. He moved it to the Oval Office in January 1961. It sat on the Resolute desk between a stack of briefing papers and a model of the USS Constitution. And visitors who knew what it was sometimes asked to hold it, and Kennedy let them. He said once, to an interviewer who asked if it was a good luck charm, that it was not. He said it was a reminder that the people who saved his life had paddled a dugout canoe through 38 miles of enemy water because an Australian nobody had ever heard of had told them to check anyway. Byuku Gasa died in 2005. Ironi Kumana died in 2014. Neither of them ever learned to read English. Both of them knew, for the rest of their long lives, exactly what they had carried. The coconut is still in Boston. It sits in a climate-controlled case at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum on Columbia Point, behind glass, under lights calibrated to preserve the carved husk for another century. School groups walk past it every weekday. Most of them do not stop. The 15 words carved into the shell are hard to read now. The husk has darkened, and the knife cuts have filled in. And the plaque beside the case is brief enough that you can miss it if you are walking fast. But Amagiri's bow is gone, scrapped for steel at the bottom of the South China Sea. The destroyer that sliced PT-109 in half on a moonless night in Blackett Strait rusted into nothing within a year of the ramming, and the empire that built her rusted into nothing within 2. The coconut is still here. One of them was built to last. The other one lasted anyway.